As Hyunwoo left the war room escorted by his armored soldiers, Commander Vextar stared out at the debris field floating in space, where his mighty fleet had once patrolled. The twisted metal and scattered pieces told the story of the most complete military defeat in hegemony history. Ships that had conquered dozens of worlds were now nothing more than space junk, drifting in the darkness. The remaining alien officers sat in stunned silence trying to process what had just happened to them. Major Corden kept flexing his clawed hands as if he could not believe they had failed him so completely. Captain Thek stared at his poisonous spines, wondering how weapons that had killed hundreds of enemies could be rendered so useless. Lieutenant Korth's mandibles clicked in a slow rhythm that showed his species was in shock. Outside the viewport, more human warships continued to materialize from quantum stealth, revealing the true size of the force that had been hidden around them. The Terran fleet was enormous, with ships of designs that the aliens had never seen before. Each vessel looked like it had been built specifically for warfare, rather than adapted from civilian designs. Commander Vexitar realized that they had not just lost a battle, but had awakened something in humanity that the galaxy was completely unprepared to face. The humans had been content to remain peaceful, as long as others respected that choice, but when forced into war, they had proven to be devastatingly effective. The alien commander began to understand that everything the hegemony believed about galactic power structures was wrong. They had assumed that the most aggressive species would naturally dominate the peaceful ones. The humans had just proven that choosing peace was not the same thing as being incapable of war. Lieutenant Korth broke the silence by asking how the humans had developed such advanced military technology without anyone in the galaxy knowing about it. The question had been bothering all of them because the level of sophistication they had witnessed seemed impossible for a species that avoided conflict. Major Cordon suggested that perhaps humanity had been preparing for war all along while pretending to be peaceful. He wondered if their entire diplomatic approach had been an elaborate deception, designed to make other species underestimate them. The idea was frightening because it implied a level of long-term planning that most species were incapable of. Captain Thek shook his head and pointed out that human diplomatic efforts had been genuine and effective for decades. They had prevented countless wars and saved millions of lives through negotiation. The humans had not been pretending to prefer peace. They actually did prefer it, which made their military capabilities even more impressive. Commander Vexitar came to a realization that chilled him to his core. The humans had not been hiding their military power because they were afraid to use it. They had been hiding it because they were afraid of what would happen if they did use it. The restraint had been for everyone else's protection, not their own. The implications were staggering because it meant that humanity had been the dominant military power in the galaxy for years without anyone knowing it. Every species had been living at human mercy while believing themselves to be independent. The thought was humbling and terrifying at the same time. One of the human guards entered the war room and informed the prisoners that transport ships were arriving to take them to the neutral station, where they would await trial. The guard's voice was professional and courteous, showing no hatred or desire for revenge, despite what the hegemony had done to human colonies as they were led through the corridors of their former flagship. The alien officers could see the extent of the damage the executioners had caused. The ship's interior had been systematically destroyed with precision that spoke of expert knowledge of alien ship design. The humans had known exactly where to strike for maximum effect. The bodies of hegemony warriors lay throughout the ship, but they had not been mutilated or desecrated. The executioners had killed efficiently and moved on without wasting time on cruelty. The contrast with hegemony methods was stark, because the aliens had always taken pleasure in the suffering of their enemies. Commander Vextar noticed that human medics were treating wounded hegemony soldiers with the same care they would give to their own people. The aliens who had shown no mercy to human civilians were receiving medical attention and proper care. The display of humanity was more effective than any speech about moral superiority. As they reached the transport ship, Lieutenant Korth asked one of the guards why the humans were treating their prisoners so well when the hegemony had shown no such consideration to human captives. The question seemed to genuinely puzzle him because his species did not understand the concept of mercy toward defeated enemies. The human guard explained that treating prisoners well was not about the prisoners but about maintaining their own humanity. He said that the moment they started acting like their enemies, they would become no different from them. The humans fought to protect their values, not to abandon them. Major Cordon found himself thinking about all the civilians his forces had killed over the years. For the first time, he began to understand that those people had been individuals with families and dreams just like the humans he had met today. The realization was uncomfortable because it made his past actions seem less like military operations and more like Murder Captain Thex watched through a porthole as more human ships arrived to begin cleanup operations. They were not just warships, but also medical vessels and reconstruction units. The humans were already working to help the survivors and repair the damage even though the battle had just ended. The efficiency and organization of the human response was impressive, but what struck the alien officers most was the complete lack of celebration or triumph among the human soldiers. They had just won the most decisive military victory in recent galactic history, but they showed no joy or satisfaction in their achievement. Commander Vextar began to understand that the humans took no pleasure in warfare, despite being so good at it. They viewed violence as a necessary evil rather than a source of glory. The attitude was completely foreign to hegemony thinking, but it explained why they had been so effective. As their transport ship departed from the debris field, the alien prisoners could see the full scope of what had happened to their fleet. Hundreds of ships that had represented the military might of an entire civilization were now twisted wreckage floating in space. The sight was both humbling and terrifying. The human pilot announced that they would reach the neutral station in 6 hours, where they would be processed according to Galactic Council procedures. He assured them that they would be treated fairly and that their basic needs would be met during their confinement. The professional courtesy was almost harder to bear than hatred would have been. Lieutenant Korth realized that word of their defeat would spread throughout the galaxy within days. Every species that had feared hegemony expansion would learn that humanity was willing and able to protect the innocent. The balance of power in galactic politics had shifted permanently. Major Cordon understood that other aggressive species would now have to reconsider their expansion plans, knowing that humanity would intervene if they targeted civilians. The age of easy conquest was over, because there was now a force in the galaxy that could not be intimidated or defeated through conventional means. Captain Thex found himself wondering how many other species had military capabilities they kept hidden. Perhaps the galaxy was full of peaceful civilizations that were actually more dangerous than anyone realized. The thought that strength could be concealed behind diplomacy was a new concept for him, Commander. Vextar spent the journey staring out at the stars, thinking about how everything had changed in a single day. The hegemony had been one of the most feared military powers in the galaxy, but they had been destroyed by a species they had considered weak. The reversal was so complete that it seemed like a nightmare. As they approached the neutral station, the alien prisoners could see news ships from dozens of species already gathering to report on the story. The defeat of the hegemony fleet would be the biggest galactic news in decades and would reshape how every civilization thought about humanity. The human guard informed them that they would be given the opportunity to contact their families and legal representatives once they were processed. He explained that the Galactic Council took prisoner rights seriously and that they would be treated according to the highest standards of interstellar law. Commander Vextar realized that this was probably the last time he would see space as a free being. His actions had led to the deaths of thousands of innocent people, and now he would face justice for those crimes. The humans had given him more consideration than he had ever given to his victims. As the transport ship docked at the neutral station, the alien officers prepared to face a future they had never imagined possible. They had gone from being conquerors to being prisoners in a matter of hours. The speed of their fall from power was a lesson that would not be forgotten by anyone who heard their story. The galaxy had learned a new truth about humanity on this day. Humans preferred peace and diplomacy, but they were devastatingly effective at war when forced to fight. The message would spread to every corner of known space, changing the balance of power forever. The age of preying on the innocent was over. Hyun-woo answered Captain Thex's question in a voice that was completely calm and professional. He said that he could do what he had been trained to do, what he had been made to do. He could end this war in the most efficient way possible. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made every alien in the room feel like the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. The human reached into his briefcase again, but this time he did not pull out a data pad. Instead, he withdrew what appeared to be a small device that looked like it might be a communication tool or perhaps a scanner. The object was unremarkable, and the aliens relaxed slightly because they could see no obvious threat from such a simple piece of technology. Hyun Woo examined the device with professional interest as he began to explain something about executioners that the aliens had never considered. He said that executioners did not operate like traditional military forces. They did not win battles through superior firepower or overwhelming numbers. Instead, they achieved victory through 3 key elements: preparation, patience, and precision. Major Cordon clicked his mandibles aggressively, as his species did when preparing for violence. He had heard enough talk and wanted to see action. He declared that he was tired of human mysticism and psychological games. He told Hyun Woo that if the human thought his little gadget would save him from alien claws and fangs, then he was more foolish than they had originally believed. The Major's outburst seemed to break the strange tension that had been building in the room. The other aliens began to remember their own strength and natural advantages over this single human Captain Thex displayed, his poisonous spines more prominently. Lieutenant Korth began moving his razor-sharp limbs in patterns that suggested incoming violence. Commander Vextar growled low in his throat. Hyun Woo looked up from his device, and this time there was no mistaking the predatory gleam in his dark eyes. The transformation was complete, and the diplomatic mask was entirely gone. The person standing before them was no longer pretending to be anything other than exactly what the insignia on his collar proclaimed him to be. The human told Major Cordon that the device was not a weapon at all, but something much more dangerous. It was a transmitter that had been broadcasting everything that had happened in the war room for the past hour. The signal had been sent directly to the Terran fleet, and every word of their conversation had been recorded and analyzed. The aliens froze as they tried to process this information. They had detected no signals and seen no evidence of any transmission. Their jamming systems were some of the most advanced in the galaxy and should have blocked any communication attempts. The idea that the human had been broadcasting under their noses seemed impossible. Commander Vextar rushed to a control panel and began frantically checking his ship's sensor readings. He demanded to know how any transmission could have gotten past their electronic warfare systems. The hegemony had invested enormous resources in making sure their ships could not be monitored or infiltrated by enemy intelligence. Hyun Woo explained that their jamming systems were designed to block conventional communication methods. But quantum entanglement transceivers operated on entirely different principles that made traditional jamming useless. The technology allowed instant communication across any distance without using detectable signals. The human continued his explanation by saying that the transmission itself was not the important part. The real significance was what the signal had accomplished. He had just confirmed to Admiral Park that the entire hegemony leadership was gathered in one location, with minimal additional security, and completely unaware of what was about to happen to them. Lieutenant Korth demanded to know what was supposed to happen to them. He was trying to maintain his aggressive posture, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that had not been there before. The situation was developing in ways that none of the aliens had anticipated, and their confidence was beginning to crack. Hyun Woo pressed a button on his device and a soft chime filled the room. The sound was gentle and musical, but every alien warrior reacted to it as if they had heard their own death sentence. The human explained that the chime was a confirmation signal that told Admiral Park the hegemony leadership was confirmed as a legitimate target. The ship suddenly shuddered with tremendous force, throwing several of the aliens off balance. Emergency lights began flashing throughout the vessel, and alarm klaxons started wailing with a sound that indicated immediate danger. The hegemony warship that had seemed so powerful and secure moments before was now clearly under attack. Commander Vexitar stumbled to his command console as another massive impact rocked the ship. His clawed fingers flew over the controls as he desperately tried to understand what was happening to his vessel. The sensor readings made no sense because they showed no approaching enemy ships, no weapons fire, and no obvious source of the damage. The commander roared in frustration and disbelief as he read the impossible data. His sensors detected nothing, but his ship was clearly being torn apart by some kind of attack. The contradiction made no sense according to everything he knew about space warfare. There had to be enemy ships out there, but his instruments insisted that space around them was empty. Hyun-woo remained perfectly steady despite the chaos surrounding him. He stood calmly in the center of the shaking room, as if he had expected every impact and every alarm. The human's composure was more unnerving than any display of violence could have been, because it suggested he knew exactly what was happening. The human began to explain Terran executioner protocol in the same calm voice he had used for diplomatic negotiations. He said that executioner operations did not rely on conventional warfare, but instead used advanced technology that most species had never encountered. Stealth ships with quantum masking technology could exist in different quantum states. Lieutenant Korth stumbled to another sensor station as the ship shook again. His earlier arrogance was completely gone, replaced by barely controlled panic. He reported massive hull breaches on multiple decks but insisted that no enemy weapons fire had been detected. The contradiction was driving the alien warriors to the edge of madness. Hyun-woo identified the source of the explosions as boarding, teams using what humans called ghost boarding techniques. Executioner assault units could materialize directly inside enemy vessels without needing to cut through hulls or use traditional boarding pods. The technique was very efficient and very quiet until the assault teams wanted to make noise. The ship's communication system suddenly crackled to life, filled with panicked reports from throughout the massive vessel. Alien voices screamed about humans appearing out of nowhere like phantoms. Soldiers who had never known fear were reporting encounters with enemies who moved like shadows and struck with surgical precision. Captain Thex listened to the reports with growing horror as he realized that his proud hegemony warriors were being systematically destroyed by enemies they could not even see coming. The voices on the communication system spoke of humans who seemed to vanish and reappear at will, cutting through the ship's defenses like they were made of paper. Major Cordon tried to make sense of the tactical situation, but everything he had learned about warfare was proving useless. The humans were not following any known military doctrine. They were not using standard weapons or tactics, and they seemed to be everywhere. At once, despite their small numbers, Commander Vextar spun around to face Hyun-woo with his amber eyes blazing with rage and terror. He screamed that what was happening was impossible because humans were supposed to be weak and soft. They were supposed to prefer talking to fighting, and they were supposed to be incapable of this kind of warfare. Hyun-woo's expression remained unchanged as he corrected the commander's assumptions. He explained that most humans were indeed soft and preferred peace, cooperation, and diplomacy. But the commander had made the critical mistake of thinking that preference was the same thing as weakness or inability. Another explosion echoed through the ship, much closer than the previous ones. The lights flickered, and several control panels sparked and went completely dark. The war room that had seemed so secure and intimidating was now clearly just another compartment in a dying ship. The human continued his explanation by telling the aliens that humans were actually very good at warfare. Perhaps too good, which was why most of them chose not to engage in it unless they had no other choice. But when that choice was taken away, when peaceful people were murdered for no reason other than cruelty, then the galaxy discovered what humans were truly capable of. The main door to the war room suddenly buckled inward with a tremendous crash that sent pieces of metal flying across the room. Through the twisted wreckage stepped figures in dark armor that seemed to bend light around itself, making them difficult to focus on directly. Their weapons were unlike anything the aliens had ever seen. The lead armored figure stepped forward and gave Hyun-woo a crisp military salute. The soldier reported that the ship was secured with enemy casualties at 97% and human casualties at 0. The numbers were delivered in the same calm professional tone that Hyun-woo had been using throughout the encounter. Major Cordon stared at the armored soldiers in complete horror as he processed what he had just heard. 97% casualties meant that almost every warrior on the ship had been killed or incapacitated, but there had been OV Commander Vexistar found his voice and asked the question that was haunting all of the surviving aliens. He said he did not understand how humanity could possess such overwhelming military power and yet choose to hide it from the galaxy. Why would they pretend to be weak when they were clearly capable of destroying any enemy? They faced. Yun Wu turned away from the viewport, and for the first time since the battle began, his expression showed something other than cold professionalism. There was genuine sadness in his dark eyes, along with a deep regret that seemed to come from somewhere very personal. The change was subtle, but it made the human seem more real and somehow more dangerous. The human explained that humanity hid its true capabilities because they remembered what they were truly capable of doing. Long before humans had reached the stars, they had fought wars on their home planet that had devastated entire continents. They had developed weapons that could destroy all life on Earth, and they had learned that their capacity for violence knew no natural limits. Yun Wu gestured toward the armored soldiers standing guard around the room. He explained that when humanity finally achieved peace on Earth and began exploring space, they had made a collective decision as a species. They would become diplomats, explorers, teachers, and traders, anything except conquerors. They would use their darker military capabilities only when absolutely necessary. The human continued by saying that humanity had established strict oversight for units like the executioners, because they understood the danger of unleashing such forces without proper control. The galaxy had benefited from human restraint for decades, without ever realizing how close they had come to seeing what unrestricted human warfare looked like. Captain Thex made a sound that might have been a whimper as he began to understand the implications of what he was hearing. If humanity had been holding back their true military power, then every species in the galaxy had been living at human mercy without knowing it. The thought was terrifying, because it meant humans could have conquered everyone long ago. Lieutenant Korth dared to speak in a voice that was much smaller than his usual aggressive tone. He suggested that surely the complete destruction of their fleet was an excessive response to the attack on one human colony. He was desperately hoping that this was all some kind of misunderstanding that could still be resolved. The temperature in the room seemed to drop again as Hyun Woo's gaze fixed on the lieutenant with the same intensity that had frightened them earlier. The human's voice became quiet and dangerous as he corrected the alien's understanding of the situation. This was not about one colony, but about a pattern of systematic violence. Hyun Woo moved to a control console and activated a holographic display that showed the hegemony's area of operations over the past year. Red markers appeared on the star map indicating attack sites, and the display showed dozens of them spanning multiple star systems. The scope of hegemony aggression was laid out for everyone to see. The human began listing the hegemony's crimes. In detail, 17 human settlements had been attacked over 6 months with 12,000 civilians killed. But before that, the hegemony had spent 3 years terrorizing the Centauri trade routes, attacking cargo ships, and enslaving their crews. The pattern showed escalating violence against innocent people. Commander Vextar looked at the holographic display with growing horror as he began to understand the true scope of what his forces had accomplished. In the excitement of easy victories and the intoxication of conquest, he had lost track of just how many innocent lives had been destroyed for hegemony. Glory Hyun Woo explained that the Galactic Council had repeatedly petitioned the hegemony government to stop these attacks. They had offered trade agreements, resource sharing, and even tribute payments in exchange for peace. The hegemony's response had been to increase the frequency of raids and begin targeting civilian populations specifically. The human's voice carried a edge of controlled anger as he pointed out that this was not about military conflict between equals, but about the systematic murder of peaceful people who had never threatened the hegemony. The victims had never harmed anyone, and had never had any chance to defend themselves against superior military technology. Major Corridon tried to defend their actions by saying that they were warriors, and that taking what they needed from weaker species was simply the natural order of things. He claimed that the strong had always dominated the weak throughout galactic history, and that the hegemony was just following natural law. Hyun Woo turned to face the Major, with an expression that made the armored alien wish he had remained silent. The human explained that there was a difference between strength and cruelty, between conquest and massacre. The hegemony had not been taking what they needed, but had been killing for the pleasure of killing. One of the armored executioner. Soldiers stepped forward and handed Hyunwoo a datapad. The human glanced at the information briefly and nodded before looking back at the defeated alien officers. His next words would change their understanding of their situation completely. The human reported that Admiral Park had sent word that the remainder of the hegemony fleet had been neutralized using the same ghostboarding techniques that had taken their flagship. The hegemony homeworld had surrendered unconditionally when faced with the choice between total destruction and complete submission to human terms. Hyunwoo continued reading from the datapad as he explained that the hegemony government had agreed to pay full reparations for all damages caused during their raids. They had also agreed to turn over all individuals responsible for planning and executing attacks on civilian targets for trial under Galactic Council law. The human looked directly at Commander Vextar as he delivered the final piece of information. The list of individuals to be turned over for trial included the commander and all of his senior staff. Every person in the room was now a war criminal, facing justice for their actions against innocent people. Commander Vextar felt his last hope disappear as he realized that there would be no negotiating their way out of this situation. The humans had not come to bargain or make deals. They had come to end the threat that the hegemony represented once and for all. The alien commander asked in a voice, barely above a whisper, what would happen to them now. He wondered if they would face summary execution or some other form of immediate justice. The idea of a quick death was almost appealing compared to the alternative of facing trial for their crimes. Hyunwoo was quiet for a long moment as he considered the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that made him seem much older than his apparent years. The weight of what he had become seemed to press down on him as he prepared to answer. The human told Commander Vexitar that despite everything the hegemony had done, despite all the innocent lives lost to their cruelty, the prisoners would receive fair trials under Galactic Council law. They would be represented by competent legal counsel and their rights would be respected throughout the legal process. Commander Vextar looked up in surprise, unable to understand why the humans would show mercy to enemies who had shown none to their victims. He asked why they would bother with legal procedures when revenge would be so much easier and more satisfying. Hyunwoo explained that they were still human, despite everything that had happened. Being human meant believing that even their enemies deserved justice, rather than revenge, even when revenge would be emotionally satisfying. It meant remembering that abandoning their principles would make them no better than the enemies they fought. The human moved toward the door, but paused to look back at the defeated aliens one final time. He told them that the age of easy prey was over, and that word of what had happened would spread throughout the galaxy within days. Every species that had been terrorized by stronger neighbors would know that humanity was willing to intervene. Hyunwoo's final words carried a promise and a warning. He said that every would-be conqueror in the galaxy would learn that attacking innocent people came with a price they could not afford to pay. The message was clear, and it would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. Tar collapsed into his command chair as the reality of his situation finally hit him with full force. The fight had gone out of him completely as he stared at the armored human soldiers, who now controlled his ship. Around the war room, the surviving members of his senior staff stood under guard with their weapons taken away and their earlier arrogance completely shattered. The mighty hegemony fleet that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries had been reduced to floating scrap metal and debris in less than 2 hours. The speed and completeness of their defeat was beyond anything the aliens had thought possible. Their ships had been some of the most powerful in known space, with crews of experienced warriors who had conquered dozens of worlds. Lieutenant Korth stood against the wall with his mandibles clicking in a nervous rhythm that showed his species was close to complete panic. His natural weapons had been rendered useless against enemies who could appear and disappear at will. The insect warrior who had never known defeat was now learning what it felt like to be completely helpless. Captain. Thex had stopped displaying his poisonous spines because he finally understood that they were meaningless against the humans who had taken his ship. His species had evolved to be perfect predators, but the executioners had proven that evolution meant nothing when faced with The negotiations moved to the ship's war room, which was the largest chamber on the entire vessel. The walls were lined with trophies from battles the hegemony had won over many years. Skulls from different alien species hung like decorations showing off their military victories. Weapons from conquered armies were displayed in glass cases. Each item told a story of defeat and destruction that the hegemony had brought to other worlds. The room was designed to intimidate visitors and make them feel small and helpless. Massive chairs made for alien bodies surrounded a huge metal table that could seat 50 beings. The ceiling was high and dark, making the space feel like a cave where predators might live. Everything about the room was meant to remind anyone who entered that they were in the presence of superior military power. Yun-Woo sat at the table looking extremely small among the towering alien warriors. His simple diplomatic clothes made him appear even more out of place in this room full of weapons and battle trophies. The aliens arranged themselves around him in a way that blocked all the exits, making it clear that he was trapped. The lighting cast long shadows that made their natural weapons look even more dangerous. Commander Vextar took his place at the head of the table with his senior officers arranged on either side. Lieutenant Korth sat to his right, clicking his mandibles in a rhythm that showed his growing excitement for what he expected to be an easy victory. Captain Thex positioned himself where his poisonous spines would be most visible to the human major. Cordon cracked his knuckles, making sounds like breaking bones. The commander began the meeting by listing all the ways that humanity had supposedly offended the hegemony. He spoke about human colonies that had refused to pay tribute and human trading ships that had avoided hegemony space. He made it sound like these were acts of war, even though everyone in the galaxy knew that the hegemony was simply looking for excuses to attack weaker species. Hyun-Woo listened to all of this without showing any emotion. He opened his briefcase and pulled out what looked like a simple data pad. The device appeared to be nothing more than a standard, diplomatic tool for taking notes and recording agreements. The alien soldiers relaxed slightly when they saw it because it was clearly not a weapon of any kind. When Commander Vextar finished his speech, Hyun-Woo looked up from his datapad and began to speak in the same calm, quiet voice he had used in the docking bay. He started by correcting the commander's version of events. He explained that the hegemony fleet had been raiding human colonies for 6 months without any provocation from humanity. The human diplomat began listing facts and numbers in a way that made it clear he had done his research thoroughly. He mentioned 17 settlements that had been attacked and 12,000 civilians who had been killed. He explained that the Galactic Council had declared these attacks to be acts of war, and that humanity had responded accordingly to defend its people. Commander Vextar slammed his massive clawed fist down on the metal table with such force that it left deep scratches in the surface. The sound echoed through the war room like a gunshot. All of the alien soldiers shifted into more aggressive postures, showing their natural weapons and making threatening sounds. The temperature in the room seemed to rise from their collective anger and bloodlust. The commander roared that the human species knew nothing about real war. He talked about how the hegemony had crushed empires that had spanned multiple star systems. He described battles where they had wiped out entire civilizations and claimed their worlds. He demanded to know what soft, weak humans could possibly do against warriors who had conquered half the galaxy. The other aliens in the room voiced their agreement with sounds that ranged from clicks to roars to hisses. They had all studied human military capabilities and found them lacking. Humans seemed to rely too much on technology and teamwork, instead of individual strength and natural fighting ability. They believed that any species without claws, fangs, or armor was automatically inferior in combat. Captain Thex leaned forward menacingly, displaying his razor-sharp natural weapons. He had killed hundreds of enemies in hand-to-hand combat, and he could not imagine how creatures as soft as humans could pose any real threat. His species had evolved as apex predators, and he found it insulting that anyone would compare human soldiers to real warriors. Major Cordon flexed his heavily armored limbs, making cracking sounds that were meant to intimidate the human. His species was known throughout the galaxy for being nearly indestructible in battle. He had personally survived attacks that would have killed most other life forms, and he had never met a human in combat before. Lieutenant, Korth began clicking his mandibles in a faster rhythm that indicated his species was preparing for violence. His natural weapons could cut through most metals, and his reflexes were faster than almost any other creature in known space. He was eager to demonstrate why insect warriors were feared throughout the galaxy. Throughout all of this aggressive display, Hyun Woo remained perfectly calm and unmoved. He continued reading from his data pad as if the threatening aliens around him were nothing more than background noise. His casual attitude only made the aliens angrier because they interpreted it as either stupidity or disrespect for their obvious superiority. The human diplomat seemed completely unaware of the danger he was in. Even though he was surrounded by creatures that could kill him in seconds, none of his behavior made sense to the alien warriors who were used to seeing fear and submission from weaker species. When someone showed no fear, it usually meant they had hidden weapons or backup that had not been revealed yet. Hyun-woo looked up from his datapad and made eye contact with each of the alien officers around the table. When he spoke again, his voice carried a slight edge that had not been there before. He said that, according to their intelligence, the hegemony believed humans were weak because they preferred negotiation to violence. The human acknowledged that this assessment was partially correct, because most humans did prefer peace to war. However, he suggested that the hegemony had made a critical error in their understanding of human nature. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in before continuing with what sounded like a warning. Major Cordon demanded to know what error the aliens had supposedly made. He asked if humans thought their technology was superior, or if they believed their numbers would make a difference in a real war. He made it clear that he found the very idea of human military superiority to be laughable and impossible. Hyun Woo looked directly at the Major, and for just a brief moment something flickered in his dark eyes. Something cold and dangerous that made the nearest aliens instinctively take a step backward. The change was so quick that most of them convinced themselves they had imagined it, but a few began to feel the first hints of uneasiness. The human closed his datapad with a soft click that somehow seemed louder than all the alien threats that had filled the room. He placed it carefully back in, his briefcase taking his time as if he was in no hurry to continue the conversation. The simple action carried a weight that none of the aliens could explain. When Hyun-woo finally spoke again, his voice was quiet, but every word seemed to carry more meaning than it should have. He told the aliens that their error was not in underestimating human technology or numbers. Instead, their mistake was much more fundamental and dangerous. The room fell completely silent, except for the low humming of the ship's engines. All of the alien warriors found themselves waiting for the human to continue, even though they could not explain why his words seemed so important. The atmosphere had changed in a way that none of them could identify, but all of them could feel. Hyun-woo looked around the table, meeting each alien's gaze before delivering his final statement. He told them that their critical error was in assuming that he was a diplomat. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and suddenly, every creature in the room began to realize that something was very wrong with this entire situation. The war room became so quiet that every small sound seemed amplified. The humming of the ship's engines that had been background noise before now seemed loud enough to hurt their ears. The alien warriors looked at each other with growing confusion, replacing the confidence they had felt just moments before. If the human was not a diplomat, then what was he doing here alone, and apparently defenseless? Commander Vextar narrowed his glowing amber eyes as he studied the human more carefully. Something about the situation was beginning to feel wrong, but he could not identify exactly what it was. The human still looked small and weak, but there was something in his manner that suggested hidden depths. The commander had survived many battles by learning to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts were warning him of danger. The commander demanded that Hyun-woo explain himself immediately. He wanted to know if the human was a spy sent to gather intelligence about hegemony forces. He asked if Hyun-woo was some kind of assassin. Though the idea seemed ridiculous given his lack of visible weapons, he even wondered if the human might be a special forces operative, though no human military unit had ever impressed the hegemony. Before Hyun-woo carefully closed his datapad and placed it back in his briefcase. The action was simple and ordinary, but somehow it carried weight like a gunfighter putting his hand on his weapon. The human's entire demeanor began to shift in subtle ways that the alien warriors could sense but not fully understand. The casual, almost bored expression was fading away. When Hyun-woo looked up again, his face had changed. The neutral diplomatic mask was gone, replaced by something focused and predatory. His dark eyes now held an intensity that made even the most battle-hardened aliens feel uncomfortable. The transformation was not dramatic, but it was complete, like watching a house cat reveal itself to be a tiger. The human spoke in a voice that was still quiet, but now carried an edge that cut through the silence like a blade. He explained that he had been a diplomat for 15 years, during which time he had negotiated treaties, prevented wars, and saved millions of lives through peaceful means. He had been very good at his work, and he had believed deeply in the power of diplomacy to solve problems. Hyun-woo paused, and his voice dropped even lower as he continued. He said that his faith in peaceful solutions had lasted until the hegemony forces attacked a place called Colony 7. The way he said the name made it clear that this was not just another settlement to him, but something much more personal and important. The alien warriors had heard of Colony 7 because it had been one of their most successful raids. The settlement had been chosen specifically because it was peaceful and lightly defended. The colonists had been farmers and families who had never posed any threat to anyone. The attack had been easy and profitable, with minimal resistance from the human's captain. Thex remembered the raid and felt a moment of pride in how efficiently his forces had completed their mission. They had taken everything of value and eliminated all witnesses just as they had been. Trained to do. The settlement had been wiped off the map as if it had never existed, and the hegemony had gained new resources and territory. Hyun-woo continued speaking about Colony 7 in a voice that was becoming colder with each word he explained. That the settlement had been home to 12,000 people who were farmers, teachers, children, and elderly settlers who just wanted to live in peace. They had never harmed anyone and had never posed any threat to the hegemony or any other species. Lieutenant Korth shifted nervously as he began to understand that this was becoming more than just a negotiation. The human's manner was changing in ways that made the insect warrior's natural predator instincts activate. He could sense danger approaching, but he could not identify where it was coming from. The human diplomat looked directly at Lieutenant Korth with an intensity that actually made the alien warrior take a step backward. Hyun-woo corrected the lieutenant's earlier statement about casualties being expected in war. He said that what happened at Colony 7 was not war but massacre, because the colonists had never been soldiers and had never fought back. Hyun-woo's voice became even quieter as he revealed the personal connection that had brought him to the ship. Among the 12,000 people killed at Colony 7 were his wife Soo-young and his daughter, Ha-eun. They had been visiting his wife's parents for a harvest festival when the hegemony forces arrived. They had died, along with everyone else, simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the aliens began to understand that they were not dealing with a random diplomat, but with someone who had a very personal reason for being there. The most bloodthirsty warriors in the hegemony fleet suddenly felt something they rarely experienced, which was the beginning of real fear. Major Cordon tried to maintain his aggressive posture but found it difficult when faced with the human's calm intensity. There was something about Hyun-woo's complete lack of emotion that was more frightening than any display of rage would have been. The human was not broken by grief or mad with anger, but something far more dangerous. The human stood slowly from his chair, and the simple movement somehow carried more menace than all the alien threat displays combined. He explained that the person who had been a diplomat for 15 years had died, with his family on Colony 7. The man the aliens were now dealing with had a very different job description. As Hyun-woo rose from his seat, his diplomatic robes shifted slightly, and for the first time the aliens caught a glimpse of something that made their blood run cold. It was a small insignia on his collar, barely visible but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. The symbol was simple, but carried meaning that sent shockwaves through every military mind in the room. Commander Vextar's eyes widened as recognition hit him like a physical blow. The insignia was a black circle with a single silver line through it. To most species in the galaxy it would mean nothing, but to military commanders and those who dealt in the darker aspects of galactic politics, It was one of the most feared symbols in known space. The symbol marked Hyun-woo as a Terran executioner, a member of humanity's most elite and most secret military unit. The executioners were supposed to be myths and legends told to frighten rebellious colonies. Most military experts believed they did not exist because humans were supposed to lack the stomach for such dark work. Lieutenant Korth whispered that it was impossible because everyone knew the executioners were just stories. The idea that humans could create and operate such a unit went against everything the galaxy believed about human nature. Humans were supposed to be too soft and moral to engage in the kind of warfare that executioners. Represented Captain Thek stared at the insignia, trying to convince himself that it had to be fake or meaningless. But deep down, he knew that no one would wear such a symbol unless they had earned the right to do so. The implications were terrifying, because if the executioners were real, then everything the hegemony believed about human military capability was wrong. Major Cordon felt his confidence crumbling as he realized that they might have made a terrible mistake in attacking human colonies. If humanity had been hiding military units like the executioners, then the hegemony had not been raiding weak settlements but had been poking a sleeping dragon with a very sharp stick. Hyun-woo smiled for the first time since entering the ship, but there was no warmth or humor in the expression. It was the cold smile of a predator who had been patient but was now ready to act. He told the aliens that most humans did not have the stomach for the kind of work executioners did. But then again, most humans had not watched their families die for no reason. The human began walking slowly around the table, and the alien warriors found themselves backing away from him without conscious thought. These were some of the most feared predators in the galaxy, but they were retreating from an unarmed human diplomat. The reversal was so complete that none of them could fully process what was happening. As Hyun-woo moved, he explained that the Terran Executioner Corps had been established after an incident that taught humanity a hard lesson about the price of appearing weak. When other species thought humans were too peaceful to fight back, they learned differently. But the lesson came at a cost that humanity was not willing to pay again. Humans stopped walking and looked directly at Captain Thex, who was trying to regain some composure by flexing his natural weapons. Hyun-woo asked what the captain thought one human could do against an entire ship of warriors. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and every alien in the room waited for an answer they were afraid to hear. The massive alien warship called Crimson Fang moved through space like a metal mountain floating in the darkness. The ship was bigger than most space stations and covered in thick armor plates that had seen many battles. Scorch marks and dents told stories of conquered worlds and defeated enemies. The ship docked at the neutral station with loud mechanical sounds that echoed through the metal corridors. Commander Vextar stood in the main docking bay, watching through a large window as a small human transport ship approached. His reptilian body was covered in dark green scales marked with old battle scars. Each scar represented a victory in combat against other species. His amber eyes glowed in the dim light as he studied the approaching vessel. The human ship looked tiny compared to his warship, like a mouse approaching a dragon. Behind Commander Vexitar stood rows of alien soldiers from his crew. They were all different species, but they shared one thing in common. They were all predators who had earned their place through violence and strength. There were tall insect-like creatures with razor-sharp claws. There were bear-like aliens with thick fur and massive teeth. There were snake people with poisonous fangs and quick reflexes. All of them carried weapons, and all of them looked ready for a fight. The soldiers talked among themselves in low voices, making sounds like growls, clicks, and hisses. They had heard stories about human diplomats from other crews. Humans were supposed to be soft, weak creatures who could not fight. They preferred talking to fighting, and they always tried to make peace instead of war. The alien soldiers found this very amusing. They thought humans were cowards who had somehow talked their way into galactic politics. Lieutenant Korth stepped forward beside his commander. Korth was an insect creature with 4 arms and a hard shell covering his body. His mandibles clicked together when he spoke, which was his way of showing amusement. He had fought many battles and killed many enemies, but he had never faced a human in combat. He was curious to see what all the stories were about. The airlock between the ships opened with a loud hissing sound. Steam poured out as the Pressure equalized between the two vessels. The alien soldiers all turned their attention to the opening, waiting to see what the humans had sent to negotiate with them. They expected to see a group of diplomats with guards and weapons. Instead, only one figure stepped through the airlock. Hyun Woo walked into the alien ship wearing simple diplomatic robes that looked more like a business suit than military gear. He carried only a small briefcase and had no visible weapons anywhere on his body. He was average height for a human, which made him look very small compared to the alien soldiers around him. His black hair was neat, and his face showed no emotion as he looked at the creatures surrounding him. The alien soldiers began to laugh in their own ways. The insect creatures clicked their mandibles faster. The bear-like aliens made rumbling sounds deep in their chests. The snake people hissed, with what could only be amusement. They could not believe that humanity had sent just one small unarmed person to face an entire warship full of trained killers. Major Cordon pushed through the crowd to get a better look at the human. He was one of the largest aliens on the ship with thick armor plating covering his entire body. His species was known for being nearly impossible to kill in hand-to-hand combat. He had personally torn apart enemy soldiers with his bare claws, and he found it insulting that the humans thought this small creature could negotiate with warriors like them. Captain Thex also moved closer to examine the human diplomat. His species had natural weapons that could cut through metal and poison that could kill most other life forms in minutes. He had expected humans to at least send someone who looked dangerous or who carried impressive weapons. Instead, they had sent what looked like an office worker, who probably had never seen real combat. Hyun Woo walked calmly through the corridor of hostile aliens. Each one was at least twice his size and covered in natural weapons like claws, fangs, spines, and armor. He showed no fear, even though he was completely outnumbered and surrounded by creatures that could kill him easily. His expression remained neutral, almost bored, as if he was walking through a normal office building instead of an enemy warship. The alien soldiers interpreted his calm behavior as either stupidity or ignorance. They thought he did not understand how much danger he was in. They believed that humans were so sheltered and peaceful that they could not recognize real threats when they saw them. This made them even more amused and more confident that this negotiation would be very easy. Commander Vextar stepped forward, blocking Hyun Woo's path. His massive frame cast a long shadow over the human diplomat. The commander was over 8 feet tall, and his presence filled the room with an aura of danger and violence. He had killed enemy leaders with his bare hands and conquered entire star systems for the hegemony. He looked down at the small human with a mixture of amusement and growing anger. The commander spoke in a deep voice that echoed through the docking bay, telling the human that he was Commander Vexitar of the hegemony fleet. He demanded that Hyun Woo surrender any weapons he might be hiding and submit to their terms. He explained that humanity had grown too bold and that it was time they learned their proper place in the galaxy under hegemony. Rule. Hyun Woo looked up at the massive alien commander without showing any sign of fear or intimidation. His dark eyes studied the creature in front of him with what looked like professional interest rather than terror. He tilted his head slightly, as if he was considering something important. Then he spoke in a calm, quiet voice that somehow carried clearly through the large room. The human introduced himself as Hyun Woo of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. He said that he had come to discuss terms, but not the terms the commander expected. Instead, he was there to discuss the terms of the hegemony surrender. He paused for a moment, then added that he believed there had been a serious misunderstanding about his role in these negotiations. The alien soldiers burst into what could only be described as laughter, even though it sounded more like the roars of wild beasts. The idea that this small, weaponless human was there to accept their surrender seemed like the funniest joke they had heard in years. Some of the soldiers had to hold onto the walls to keep from falling over with amusement. Commander Vextar's amber eyes blazed brighter with a mixture of amusement and growing anger. He could not decide if the human was incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Either way, he found the human's arrogance insulting. The hegemony had never surrendered to anyone, and they certainly would not surrender to a species as weak as humanity. The laughter continued echoing through the docking bay as more soldiers joined in. None of them took the human's words seriously. They saw his calm demeanor as proof that humans really were as naive and helpless as the story suggested. They had no idea that they were about to learn a very hard lesson about making assumptions based on appearances. Hyun-woo stood quietly in the center of all this chaos and laughter. His expression never changed, and he showed no sign of being bothered by their reaction. He simply waited patiently for them to finish, as if he had all the time in the world. This only made the aliens think he was even more foolish than they had originally believed. The stage was set for what would become one of the most important encounters in galactic history. The aliens thought they were dealing with a helpless diplomat. The human knew they were about to discover the difference between choosing peace and being incapable of war.